Taking this line of reasoning a little bit further, the physics, at first glance, one would think that the four most stable subatomic elements of physics, according to Dan Davidson, quoting two other fellows, which I haven't gotten into reading all their material yet, so I'm not going to quote them yet. I'll just quote Dan Davidson. In his book Shape Power, I believe it's called, or Pyramid Shape Power, or I think it's Shape Power. The proton, the neutron, the positron, which is the opposite charge of the electron, and the antiproton. It's obvious to me that the proton and the electron are the yin and the yang, and the positron and the antiproton are derivations of a third component which maintains the interplay of creation. It's that footprint which can be of two natures depending on who it interacts with, either sattva or tamas, either well, I have to take a guess estimate just for the sake of the discussion. Let's say the proton just sits there, so that would be tamas. So that means the electron is sattva, and the footprint, the ability to make a footprint, is the rajas. And when rajas combines with sattva, namely the electron, it creates the positron, and when rajas combines with tamas, the proton, it creates the antiproton. So there you have the Mahabhutas, I think they're called. They're not the elements, they're the archetypes of the elements, which means they go a little beyond the elements. And that makes sense to me as the only way to create a translation or a legend to correspond the terms of physics with the terms of the Vedic science. Now, let's see, there was one other point I wanted to make. Yes, the weak nuclear forces. There are supposedly, they try to unite the four forces of nature into a unified field theory. The problem, of course, is their assessment. They're trying to unite the four forces of nature with gravity, and the mistake is that gravity is a byproduct coming out of what is actually not the way we depict the situation. In other words, the four forces of nature are actually far simpler than four, because what happens at the nuclear level, the so-called weak forces, are actually the source or foundation for gravity. It's just that gravity, as we know it, is a specialization. It's a specialized geometry in which the yang and the yin coalesce into a ball at the core of a hollow stellar body, such as a star or planet. And that creates an amplification of what would otherwise be the weak nuclear force. To the extent that it's no longer weak, it's quite strong. Strong enough to maintain the integrity of a planet or star. It's the geometry, the integrity of the geometry of a stellar body. And of course, it's exhibited by our observation on the on this planet's surface, on the surface of the Earth, as being a quite formidable force, the force of gravity. But in reality, it's a specialization. It's a without a stellar body, there'd be no gravity. And so the unified field theory that's supposed to create this idea of why gravity exists in conjunction with the other four known four forces of nature, we just don't know what gravity is I lost my train of thought. That's too long a sentence. If it weren't for stellar bodies, we would not have gravity. And it's the unification of the four forces in the form of a stellar body. So when we're looking for the unified field theory, it's right under our feet. It's hidden in plain sight. It's right under our feet. It's the stellar body known as the Earth, planet Earth, that we stand on, which is a perfect example, the closest one we have, closer to than the moon, that exhibits the unified field theory in action. It's right under our feet, right under our noses. So we don't need to look any further for a unified field theory. It's right under our feet. That is the source of gravity. That is the integration of the four so-called four forces of nature into a unified field. The field of the Earth, the gravitational field of the Earth, is merely a byproduct of a stellar body. The construction, the geometric construction of a very specialized organism, a very specialized function. Otherwise, we'd just have a bunch of, the forces that we know about, electromagnetism and whatnot. But we wouldn't have the phenomenon of gravity if it were not for the specialized function of a stellar body such as the planet Earth, which is hollow, which has a core made up of material that is highly specialized, almost virtual, not quite virtual. What makes Rajas virtual, the element that's closest to the ether, is the fact that it would be an extraction of our natural observation of our environment to propose pure rajas, pure footprint. Because a footprint is a virtual existence, which is which is the byproduct of protons and electrons, namely tamas and sattva, interacting with the ether to create that footprint, or interacting with each other, actually. Whichever. Interacting with the ether as an interface between each other, or the buffer acting as the buffer between each other, which creates this doesn't create, actually. Well, it creates this virtuality of the footprint being in one of two forms, namely the footprint of a proton or the footprint of an electron. In other words, the effect that the existence of the proton or electron has on its position in space, or ether if you prefer. So the proton and electron has to exist in space, and so they have to have a footprint. Yet if we analyze the situation, the nature of a footprint is that it can take on any shape, whether it's a left footprint or a right footprint. It makes no difference insofar as the footprint is concerned. It makes a difference to us, functionally, but it makes no difference to the nature of the print from which the footprint arises. And that's the interaction of the proton and electron with the ether, or space, if you prefer. And so for all intents and purposes, we never see Rajas by itself. That's why it's more elegant to say that it's virtual. It's so close, it's literally the boundary. Rajas is poised on the boundary between the relative and the absolute, so to speak. If we consider the ether or space to be so amorphous as to not have any noticeable qualities in and of itself. Yet it's its interaction with the three gunas that makes possible not only the actual reality of sattva and tamas, of protons and electrons, but the virtual reality of positrons and antiprotons, arising out of. So actually, positrons and antiprotons are not virtual. They're semi-virtual and semi-actual, but they're not quite virtual. It's their root, the rajas, that is virtual, that makes the positron and the antiproton something less than something more than virtual, something more closer to being actual. But they're only something more than virtual due to the interaction of protons and electrons with the virtual rajas quality, the maintainer. So you could say, it could be said that rajas is the embodiment of dharma. That dharma is not, it's easy to think that dharma is something pure, but it's not. Charlie Lutz used to say that what do we call it when somebody gives their money to charity? Wealthy people would call it something. That quality, not charity, there's a word for it. It starts with E, I think. Philanthropist, excuse me, P. It's a PH sound. A philanthropist, by nature, is rajasic. They're mobile. They're giving of themselves to help people. So that's actually a combination of sattva and rajas. Okay? So according to this theorization, if the electron is the opposite of tamas, which tamas being inertia, and the proton is inertial, it sits at the center, then that means the electron is the combination of sattva. No. Oh dear. No, the electric field. Oh, I see. That's right. You can't have an electron without a positron. You can't have electrons sitting all by themselves. That would be impossible. Because we know from the study of current that there's always an opposing force. Hey, whatever happened to Newton's action and reaction? There's always an opposing force, and we know that from magnetism. We have EMF and we have back EMF. So if we have electrons, we would have to have an opposing current. So it's that opposing current that keeps things wanting to be mobile, wanting to be change-oriented. Anyway, so this desire for current to maintain its mobility is actually the philanthropic quality of electrodynamics, because without current set in motion, we wouldn't have this philanthropic byproduct of a circuit to give us service, to give us the benefit of that circuit. So we could have a static charge stored up in a capacitor, and we would call that what? We would call it sattva, because it's a pure potential of electrical energy in its most pure form. And it's not static. It's really, it's the dielectric. It's what, Eric Dollard would call the dielectric. It's really wrong to call it static. It's pregnant with a potential for motion, but that doesn't mean it's inertial. So what would be the equivalent? Oh, well, we have to go into protons and antiprotons and all the interaction and all the effluence, effluence, not affluence, but the effluence, the byproduct, or the emissions, the emission byproducts of protons and antiprotons, which are neutrinos and stuff. So it's getting into other area. But all these other subatomic particles that we call subatomic particles, that Dan Davidson says are short-lived and thus not the force-stable, most fundamental aspects of physics, we would then qualify them as being something similar or akin to the dynamics of an electrical circuit. In other words, we have impedance. Oh, wait a minute. And then we have resistance. Oh, wait a minute. And then we have reactance. Wait a minute. Are those subatomic particles of electrodynamics? Yeah. Just like we have subatomic particles of physics. So when we talk about when we view a dynamical situation in which we're no longer just talking about fundamental aspects, we're looking at byproducts of the interaction of those fundamental aspects, or fundamental qualities, I should say. And so, yeah, then it becomes complicated because we have to formulate a language of a greater size vocabulary than just 3 or 5 elements. So to say there are 4 stable, when Dan Davidson says there are just 4 stable subatomic particles, doesn't really talk about the situation because of the virtuality that sits on the bridge between actuality and what we would call the non-actuality of the ether. So it's really not wrong to call the ether non-actualized. I mean, we may go so far as to say it's non-existential, but of course that's wrong. It would be more accurate to say it's non-actualized. It's pregnant with the potential for everything else that we know to be actual. And of course the virtual stands between the actual and the non-actual. But it's all existence. The ether exists. It's just not actualized into something that we can appreciate. It's like saying the housewife, what she does, or the house husband, is not work. Simply because they don't earn money? That's not work? Are you kidding? They hold the whole household together, without which you might as well be living on the street or living in the bush. I mean, we fail to give credit where credit is due, and thus we deny the existence of something. Well, it doesn't mean it does not exist. We just don't want to give credit where credit is due, and that's our fault. So when I study the chakras, for instance, the petals of each chakra, like, the 4 petals of the Muladhara chakra at the base of the spine, there's a 5th chakra. There's always there's a 5th petal. There's always an extra petal to every chakra. And that is the transcendental petal that transcends the functionality of all the other petals of that particular chakra, yet is also the functional integration of all those petals into their composite whole, namely the chakra itself. So when we look at the dynamics of physics, we have to have one subatomic particle left over that Dan Davidson left out, and that's the physics itself, which is the ether. We have to say that if it were not for the ether, all of the particles and subatomic particles of physics could not exist. We have to give credit where credit is due. It's kind of like the problem of prime numbers. We don't want to include unity, the number 1. We say, no, the first prime number is the number 2. Not quite. That would be like the child saying, well, Mom and Dad, you don't exist. I just brought myself into being. And that's the child slapping the face of the parent from which the child came from. 1 is indivisible because there's nothing to divide. It's already unity. yet it has the forebear of prime numbers, inasmuch as the archetype of non-divisibility of prime numbers is entirely embodied in the number 1, the progenitor of prime numbers. So we can say that the number 1 is not prime, and yet it is the progenitor of primality. It's the father or the parent. It's the paternal or maternal. It's the source of prime numbers. So you can't separate it from prime numbers just because we don't want to include it in the list of primes. It's part of it. It's part of it. It has to be. And so we can't say the ether doesn't exist. We have to say that it's there, because without the ether, there would be no medium upon which a foot can make a print. And the two together, the 2 feet, the left foot and the right foot, creating a print that is either left or right, the ability to make a print upon the ether by a right foot or a left foot are the 3 fundamental aspects of physics, of the creation operator of electrons, the maintenance operator of the ability to have a print, and the tamasic, or the destruction operator, of the proton. Those 3 operators are at the foundation of physics, and we have to include the ether, because without it, we wouldn't have that virtual realm of mobility, the one thing we take for granted. Even when we're sleeping, we're active. And when we're not sleeping, we're active. We're always active. Didn't Krishna tell Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, I am ever active. If I should stop being active, the whole universe would collapse? And yet, this ever state of activity is virtual in its most pure essential nature, before it takes on the qualification of a positron version of activity versus an anti-proton version of activity. One or the other, they're 2 versions of activity, but in its most abstract nature, activity by itself, considered all by itself, is so virtual that it's not even actual. It's in that bridge line dividing protons and electrons on the one hand, which are quite actual, with the ether, which we don't even want to give credence to and say, oh no, the ether doesn't even exist. So I've had naysayers on the energetic forum tell me that don't bring yang and yin into this. Don't bring in all this gobbledygook. Well, I'll tell you, Dan Davidson makes it possible because he quotes his 2 sources. One fellow's, the last name is Mingst, M-I-N-G-S-T, and the other one is it Sober? Oh shoot, I can't remember the other guy's name. It starts with an S, yeah. And they mutually drafted some essays, for the lack of a better way to put it, on some fundamental aspects of physics, namely gravity was one. So I'm trying to read up on all of their theses, their exposés, to try to look at the universe from their perspective, because that's who Dan Davidson is quoting when he says there are only 4 stable subatomic particles: the proton, the electron, the positron, and the antiproton. I think they've got a real good fix on the fundamental way to look at physics. And I say that because there's a direct correlation with the Vedic terminology. But the nature of Dharma is that bridge between the 3 gunas and the Absolute. And it's the Rajas guna which is actually poised in the field of Dharma. I never thought it was. I always assumed that all the 3 gunas were on the side of actuality, but now I could see that can't be the case according to physics, according to this view of physics that Dan Davidson is quoting of his 2 sources, those 2 fellows, whose names I will get straight one of these days. Very shortly, I think after this video, I'm going to memorize those 2 guys' names by reading more of their theses. on the nature of on various natures of the physics. So it's not gobbledygook. Vedic science has been around for eternity. It's never had a beginning and it's never had an end. It just keeps getting a revival. That's all. In which the awareness of the Vedas is dim at some point in the timeline of human history, and alternating with the repetitive cycle of we lose our dimness, we gain awareness, and we gain a greater appreciation for what the Vedas provide. A very abstract understanding of creation, of ourselves. But it's only by increased self-awareness that we would appreciate the Vedas, because the Vedas is nothing but the structure of ourself. Tony Nader figured that out, Rajaram. He figured out how the physiology embodies the Vedas. So it's really self-awareness that is the key ingredient here, of having an awareness of physics at all. And as Charlie Lutz used to say, the beginning of the dawning of the Age of Enlightenment occurred with the freeing of the slaves. Lincoln's freeing of the slaves. Well, this would mean that physics was born around the time of the Civil War. And if we look at Mendeleev and his treatise on analyzing the X and Y pre-hydrogen elements of his periodic chart of the atomic elements of nature, he hypothesized the existence of X and Y, but he wasn't ready yet to share it with us. So he just shared everything else, which we've come to know as the standard theory of atomic elements, the periodic chart. But later on in the late 1800s, in the 1890s, towards the close of his life, he felt, well, I better get this out now, because now I'm more firm on this idea that X and Y exists. And of course, he refused to believe they were subatomic, but now we would have to say that they are. And in all likelihood, they're one of the four that Dan Davidson quotes, so I would have to guess they're the proton and the electron. But he said they're lighter than hydrogen. Okay, that qualifies. And they're very specific, so that means they're quite actual. So they're not going to be the outgrowth of Rajas interacting with actuality. So they would probably have to be the proton and the electron. And since the electron is lighter than the proton, and since Mendeleev said that the X is lighter than the Y, I'd have to say then that the X of Mendeleev's pre-hydrogen atomic elements, the X is sattva, is the electron, and the Y is the proton, the tamas. That's the way I'd have to describe it. Just analyzing the situation based on what little I know about the Vedic science versus what little I know about physics from Dan Davidson's point of view. Okay? So that pretty much sums it up, I believe. So it was something about gravity. Yeah, I already covered that. So that sums up this video pretty much. Okay. Sounds pretty good.